Two backpacks leaned shoulder to shoulder against an old cedar color sun-bleached to the same tired gray. A pair of boots sat beside them, laces stiff with mud as if someone had stepped out of them and meant to come back before the light changed. The wind lifted the frayed edge of a strap, and the forest answered with nothing at all. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. Most days on the mountain begin with the same quiet promise. I lived in a rental outside Ashford, a small one-story place with a wood stove that took the edge off our cool summer mornings. At 5:30 a.m., you could hear the river before the birds, just a low rush drifting in from the tree line, while the sky ran pale behind the shoulder of Rainier. I'd pour a mug of coffee pull on my duty shirt and clip the radio to my belt by habit. Out here, habits keep you honest. They also keep you alive. By 6:45, I'd be rolling through the Longmire gate windows, cracked for the smell of damp cedar and dust. The speed limit drops, and so does everyone's voice. It's not a posted rule, just the way people sound when they arrive at a place that can lift a person's heart and take it away in the same afternoon. I'd check the overnight logs, skim the weather notes, and set a yellow pad by the phone for messages that always came later than they should. On warm days, paradise fills early. Minivans, rental sedans, old Subarus with faded trail stickers, every shape of hope with a full tank. That July morning in 2018 ran clear and cool to start 61 degrees at 8 a.m., rising to the mid-70s by early afternoon, with a forecast note circled on the board: afternoon fog, likely descending fast if the wind shifted. We'd seen it before. The mountain lets you think it's tame, then pulls a white curtain and rearranges the room while you're blinking. It wasn't a storm warning, just a reminder to hold your line and respect time. In summer, respect usually means turning for home by 4. I worked the early rotation at Paradise that day, a steady procession of hikers moving across the plaza like a slow current. Families posed for group photos in front of the stone steps. Couples argued about which trail was easier for knees. Teenagers pretended not to hear their parents reminding them to fill bottles at the fountain. I remember the smell of sunscreen warming on clean skin and the sweet grass of the meadows loosening in the sun. The park has its own clock. You see it in how people carry themselves when they arrive and how they carry themselves when they leave. Just before 10, 2 girls swung into the edge of my vision, lean frames, bright packs matching ponytails. Twins. I didn't know their names yet, but I noticed the small things that matter. Broken-in boots, not new. Straps cinched tight. Paper maps folded and tucked, not just a phone screen waved in the air. They moved like kids who'd been on trails before. No swagger, just that forward lean of someone who can't wait to see what's around the bend. One of them tapped her sister's shoulder and pointed upslope as if she'd spotted something I couldn't see. They laughed in the same quick burst that makes people turn their heads without knowing why. On the far side of the lot, a silver SUV slid into a space. A woman climbed out first. Dark hair pulled back, careful eyes that scanned the lot the way my eyes do. A man followed, taller, carrying a cooler and trying not to look like he was hovering. Parents learn to perform distance when their kids start to do things on their own. They set chairs, keep a respectful radius, but every muscle is tuned to the same frequency. Bring them back safe and let it look like it was their idea. I noticed all of it in flashes, the way a person who's worked too many summers notices almost without wanting to. By noon, the paths were alive. Water bottles clicked against belts. Trekking poles ticked over rock. The sound carries out there, and sometimes that's your only clue to a person's condition, the rhythm of their steps and the breath that follows. I walked the route I always walk, edges of the meadows, the start of the loop, the small slope where thin snow lingers in shadow even in July. A marmot watched me from a flat rock, cheeks full and unbothered, while a patch of avalanche lilies stood like little white bells where the soil stays cold. High over all of it, the summit sat immaculate, as if nothing in the world ever changed. The twins passed me briefly on the lower trail, one with a small notebook tucked under a strap, the other with a camera clipped in easy reach. They thanked me when I stepped aside on a narrow bit, voices pitched, like a smile that landed and moved on. I wished them a good hike. I said it the way I say it to everyone, but I remember hearing my own voice steady and practiced, and wondering if they recognized the caution folded inside it. There's a tempo to a day on Rainier. By early afternoon, those who started early reach their turnaround point and begin drifting back toward paradise. Newer arrivals push deeper than they planned because the light is still generous and the views keep paying dividends. I ran a last check-in at the station around 2 p.m. and circled that fog note again. The forecast said it could drop in under an hour once it began. People think fog is just low cloud. On this mountain, it's a wall that eats sound and puts the ground somewhere you didn't leave it. Around 2:30, a park aide brought in a lost water bottle with a red cap. We have a shelf for found items, gloves with no partners, hats. A breeze stole bottles that rolled under a bench. I made a note on my pad and slid the bottle onto the shelf. The aide mentioned that the meadows were glowing paintbrush and lupine running in bands of color like the mountain had brushed itself for company. I said I'd take a look after I finished a call about trail work, and I did for exactly 1 minute, standing in the doorway, breathing air that tasted like stone and chlorophyll. The kind of day that makes even a veteran hold still. The loop trail saw heavier foot traffic toward 3. I helped an older couple from Iowa check a map against the terrain and pointed them toward an overlook with a bench that catches a good breeze. A ranger from a different district texted me a photo of a rescued fawn tucked in a canvas sling. I sent back a thumbs up and the line we all use when a small creature lives. Good job, little one. I saw the twins again once more in passing this time, higher up their heads bent together over the camera as they framed a small cascade buried in wildflowers. They took turns stepping in front of it, swapping places like it was choreographed. When they looked up, they were grinning at something that needed no explanation. I remember thinking, whoever taught them to move light on rock did a fine job. By late afternoon, the mountain started changing its mind. The air cooled first just a few degrees, but enough to nip at sweat-soaked shirts. Then the breeze shifted sliding down canyon, bringing a breath of cold that tasted like snow even in July. The line of sight shortened. Peaks that looked close enough to touch at noon pulled back as if they'd never been near. A gray wash crept along the timber and laid itself over the meadow like thin cloth. I carried a small handheld to the lower edge of the loop and counted groups coming out. Familiar patterns held families with tired kids and sticky fingers from the granola bars they swore they didn't want. Day hikers who'd tried a side spur and found it steeper than advertised. A pair of school teachers up from Tacoma who always stopped to tell me what they heard in the bird calls and what their students would make of it in September. A volunteer swept the spur near the creek and reported all quiet. The board by the station ticked toward 5:30. The lot clicked car doors and coughed engines. People's voices took on that relieved up note they get when the hardest part of the walk is behind them. I stepped back inside to sign out a radio battery and found a note on the pad handwriting I didn't recognize. Carter. It read underlined twice. Waiting at lot. Quick question. The name didn't ring any bell then. We field dozens of quick questions in a day. Is that ridge the one on the postcard? Why does the mountain look closer this afternoon? Where's the restroom? I pocketed the radio and walked back out to the plaza, where the air felt closer to 68 degrees, and the fog had thickened enough to make headlights necessary. The sound of gravel under tires got louder as drivers crept eyes squinting both hands on the wheel. I found the couple near the edge of the lot, 2 folding chairs angled toward the crosswalk, as if it were a stage. A cooler sat unopened between them. The woman stood first. Her eyes were steady the way a person's eyes are when she's memorizing a scene, so she can tell it back later. The man rose slower, brushing dust from his jeans, as if he needed something to do with his hands. We traded the small phrases people use when they don't want to impose. Do you have a minute? Of course. We won't keep you. You're fine. The woman glanced past me toward the trailhead and checked her watch without meaning to. Behind us, the fog pressed a little closer, turning taillights into red coins sliding through milk. We talked about trail maps, about how quickly the light can flatten distance on days like this. They told me their girls were strong walkers, careful with time, good with directions. I nodded because I've heard dozens of versions of that sentence, and most of the time it's true. The man asked about the fastest way to reach a lower parking area if the lot jammed. I traced it in the air down the hill, right at the split stay under 20. He said thanks and told me they'd wait a little longer before moving the car. He said it kindly, the way someone does when he wants to sound calm for the person he loves. The plaza thinned. The mountain lost its edges, leaving only the immediate boots on asphalt breath in the throat, the small circle of clear air around your body when mist closes in. I made another sweep of the near trails with a volunteer, checked the usual places where enthusiastic hikers drift left when they mean to drift right, then returned to the station and logged the last half hour. The radio murmured the way it does at shift change trail crews checking off. A maintenance truck calling clear. A ranger mentioning a deer near the turn who seemed unafraid of cars. At 6:45, I stepped outside and leaned a shoulder against the stone wall that holds the building like a hand. The lot felt different, quieter than it should at that hour in July, quiet enough that you notice a single zipper or the squeak of a rear hatch. The couple sat in those folding chairs. The cooler still shut, the woman's face turned toward the crosswalk, the way sunflowers turn toward light. The man unfolded and refolded a paper map, then flattened it carefully across his lap. He didn't look at it. Fog lifted and fell in slow breaths. The temperature fell another few degrees, brushing the skin at the wrist where a sleeve rides up. A pair of headlights crested the entrance and slid past us, too high to be a compact, too low to be the SUV I'd noted earlier. Gravel chattered under the tires and then faded. Somewhere beyond the mist, someone laughed, the sound small and quickly taken away. The clock on my phone touched 7:00. I checked the ridgeline out of habit and found only a wall of cloud where the sky had been. A raven called once and went silent. A breeze lifted the pages of the map in the man's hands, flipping one corner and laying it back again. The woman shifted in her chair and tapped her foot once against the leg as if to coax the minutes along. I clicked my pen and wrote the time on the pad I keep in my shirt pocket. There are moments when a place you know well feels unfamiliar by an inch. You can't point to what's changed. You only know you're listening harder than you were a minute ago. The plaza lights hummed. A single porch light in the staff housing across the road blinked on earlier than usual, as if someone didn't trust the day to hold. I looked toward the trailhead, a dark mouth under a thin veil of white, and waited for shapes to step out of it. The phone on my belt didn't ring. The crosswalk stayed empty, and the cooler between those two folding chairs stayed closed, its handle catching a bead of mist that swelled and fell without breaking. The fog that night didn't roll in all at once. It crept slow and deliberate, like something testing the edges of a room before it stepped inside. I stood near the trailhead, with the Carters, our breath making small ghosts in the damp air. It was 7:20 when I checked my watch again. The headlights that should have broken through that haze never did. Tom rubbed his hands together and said mostly to himself, "They're never this late." His voice carried that flat note people use when they're trying not to sound afraid. Sarah stayed quiet, scanning the path, as if she could will two silhouettes to appear through the white curtain. I knew better than to rush to worry fog, and darkness can play tricks on time, but something about the way that mist swallowed the sound of our voices made the silence feel heavier than usual. I told them I'd give it another hour before we called it in. Then I went inside to radio the backcountry station just in case anyone had seen the girls pass through another junction. Nobody had. By 8:30, the parking lot was down to 2 cars, theirs and mine. I offered to drive the lower access road, the one hikers sometimes mistake for a shortcut to paradise. It curls down toward the river, then dead ends at a service gate. I rolled my window down and listened, hoping for the kind of sound that doesn't belong. A shout, a whistle, even the thin crack of a twig. All I heard was water moving over rock and a few tree frogs calling from somewhere too far to matter. The radio on my seat crackled every few minutes with routine chatter, maintenance finished snowgate, secure all quiet. When I pulled back into the lot, Tom was standing beside the SUV with both hands on the roof like he was bracing himself against a gust that never came. He looked at me, eyes wet and wild around the edges, and said, "They know these trails, Ranger. They're careful girls." At 9 sharp, I called the duty officer and opened a missing person file. Protocol says to wait 12 hours for experienced hikers, but there's always room for judgment, and the look on Sarah's face made that decision easy. Within 30 minutes, we had a small response team assembling at Longmire, 2 rangers, a medic, a search dog, and me as field lead. The fog thickened as we hiked the first half-mile headlamps, painting narrow cones through the dark. The forest smelled like wet bark and cold stone. Every sound felt magnified, the click of buckles, the dog's breathing boots compressing soil that hadn't cooled since afternoon. We found nothing. No footprints, no discarded pack straps, not even a candy wrapper. It was as if the mountain had closed its hand around them. By midnight, we called off the first sweep and returned to the station. I wrote the initial report with the same pen I'd used that morning to note the fog warning. Date time coordinates weather missing persons. Mia and Lily Carter, 17, last seen departing Paradise Loop around 10 a.m. Expected return 6 p.m. Vehicle located unoccupied. I remember my handwriting starting to lean as fatigue crept in. When I looked up, Sarah was sitting in the lobby, still in her chair, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding in the cold. Tom paced near the coffee urn, his movements sharp, like every few steps. He remembered the shape of a different fear. At dawn, helicopters came in from Tacoma, slicing the low clouds into pieces. Their engines thundered through the valleys, scattering elk and shaking snow from the higher trees. The sun hadn't yet burned through the fog, and the air tasted metallic like rain waiting for a place to fall. I joined the ground teams pushing east toward the ridge. Our radio chatter filled the emptiness. Crossing the creek, no sign moving to next grid. Search dogs caught faint traces of human scent near the lower basin, but lost it where the wind funneled between cliffs. Every hiker's nightmare, the mountain's own eraser wiping tracks before they can mean anything. By the second day, we expanded the radius. Volunteers arrived in steady waves, retired firemen, trail runners, neighbors who'd seen the news. They signed waivers with shaking hands and asked the same question in different words. What are the chances? We didn't answer. I just handed them maps marked sectors and reminded them to stay within earshot. It's easier than hope to manage instructions. The Carters stayed near the command post. Sarah walked the lot each morning, studying the faces of returning searchers, waiting for one to look different, relieved perhaps or carrying something found. Tom kept busy setting up food tables, handing out bottles, pretending there was still a job to do that didn't end in heartbreak. The fourth day brought a clearing brief and cruel. The fog lifted just long enough for us to see the full scope of where they might be, miles of broken ridgeline, deep crevasses, shadowed even at noon. From above, Rainier looks alive like it's breathing under the snow. I remember thinking if they fell, we'd never know. You can't speak that aloud when families are listening, so you say, we'll keep pushing, and you do. The air thinned, the wind picked up, and by dusk the mountain closed itself again. On the seventh day, we found a torn branch and a single scuff mark near a stream, crossing nothing we could tie to a person. A few volunteers insisted it looked deliberate, but I'd seen enough false leads to recognize hope disguised as evidence. Late that night in the mess tent, I overheard a deputy whisper that maybe the twins had planned this to run away start fresh. I felt anger rise sharp in my chest. People love a story that ends somewhere neat. But neat stories don't leave two parents sleeping in their car with the engine idling for warmth. By the 10th day, we'd combed every trail twice. The official search narrowed to a skeleton crew rangers, one canine unit, a helicopter pilot who refused to stand down. We moved slower now, methodical searching not for rescue, but for reason. I hiked the ridges alone at dusk, pausing to call their names. It's strange how quickly sound disappears up there. Even my own voice came back thinner than it left. Sometimes I thought I heard something, maybe a cry, maybe a bird, but it never repeated. After a month, the operation scaled down. The field command tents folded. The volunteers went home. The media trucks that had once parked shoulder to shoulder rolled out, leaving muddy ruts in the meadow. I watched the Carters pack their cooler into the SUV they'd arrived in and drive away without saying goodbye. There's no protocol for how a family is supposed to leave a mountain that didn't give them anything back. For years, their faces stayed tacked to the bulletin board behind my desk, sun-faded but unremoved. I'd see them every morning when I clocked in the same picture that had been on every news report. Two girls standing near a waterfall, hair pulled back, arms around each other, eyes bright enough to make you forget that youth doesn't equal safety. Their photo was time-stamped at 2:32 p.m., right before everything stopped. When the anniversary came each July, Sarah sent thank you cards to the Rangers who'd stayed involved. She signed them still searching. I kept mine in a drawer. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest mysteries, but not this one. 5 years passed. Seasons came and went. The snowpack rose and melted, flooding gullies and carrying branches down toward the valley. Hikers passed through the same trails where we'd shouted those girls' names, unaware of what the earth beneath them still held. The park replaced signs, cleared debris, repainted railings. And still, whenever I walked past that cedar line near the ridge, I'd find myself listening. It's a habit I never shook. Then one morning last August, I was out on a solo inspection run after a thunderstorm. The rain had stopped around dawn, leaving the forest slick and shining. The air smelled of sap and ozone, sharp enough to wake you without coffee. I hiked a half-forgotten spur trail that cut north from the main loop, one we'd closed to the public years ago due to erosion. Fallen limbs littered the path, the ground soft beneath my boots. About a mile in, I reached a clearing where a giant cedar stood. Its trunk twisted like it had survived more winters than I could count. Something bright caught my eye near the base, 2 faded straps tangled together, colors barely clinging to the fabric. At first I thought it was litter. Then I saw the second pack leaning beside the first, the way people rest their bags when they plan to sit for lunch. A pair of boots sat neatly beside them, mud-caked but upright. My stomach dropped in that way it does when memory and present collide. I crouched down, careful not to disturb anything. The air was still. No birds, no wind, only the sound of my own breath in the quiet. I called it in immediately, voice steady even as my hands shook. Within an hour, the area was taped off and evidence bags laid out. The initials stitched into the straps, MC and LC, left no room for doubt. Inside one of the packs, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, was a small notebook swollen from years of moisture. I didn't open it then. I knew we'd have specialists for that. Still, I could see the faint trace of handwriting through the first page, a line near the bottom that caught the light just enough for me to read 2 words. Love you. When you work long enough in this field, you stop believing in coincidences. Items left that way, arranged, preserved mean intention. Someone put them there. The question is always when and why now. Standing over that cedar, I felt a pressure in my chest that wasn't fear exactly, more like recognition. The mountain was finally giving something back, but not freely. It was an exchange, and I wasn't sure what it wanted in return. The evidence techs worked quietly, cataloging each piece with a reverence that comes from experience. Every buckle, every strap, every inch of fabric told its own story of time and weather. I watched them carry the packs into the transport case the way you might carry something fragile from another world. That's when the realization settled in. We weren't closing a file, we were reopening it. When the helicopter lifted off carrying the evidence toward Tacoma for analysis, I stayed behind. The wind from the rotors pushed a spray of pine needles across the clearing, and for a moment it looked like snow. I let it fall and fade before I started the hike back down. The air had turned colder, the kind of chill that signals the change of something bigger than weather. I didn't know what we'd find yet, but I knew this much: the silence that followed me down the trail wasn't the same silence I'd walked through 5 years earlier. It had weight now. It had memory. And for the first time since those girls disappeared, it felt like the mountain might finally be ready to speak. The day after those backpacks surfaced, the park felt different. Even before sunrise, I could tell from the hum in the air, helicopters warming up radios, spitting half-sentences, boots scuffing gravel outside my office door, that the quiet years of waiting were over. Discovery brings movement, but it also brings ghosts. I'd spent 5 years walking this ground thinking the mountain had chosen silence. Now it had decided to speak, and it was my job to listen. The packs and boots had been sent overnight to Tacoma for testing. I drove down that morning to meet the forensics team. The lab sat behind a dull concrete wall that always smelled faintly of rain and metal. Inside, everything was clinical, the kind of order that helps keep the darker parts of the work from seeping too deep into you. Dr. Marcus Hale met me in the hallway, coffee in one hand, gloves already on. He's one of those people who doesn't waste time with greetings. He just handed me a clipboard and said, You need to see this." In the evidence room, the packs lay on a table under soft light. The colors were nearly gone, but the shape of each was unmistakable. One slightly larger, more worn at the straps, the other cleaner, the kind of difference you see when two people take care of their gear in slightly different ways. Marcus pointed to the stitching. The initials had held up MC and LC. Then he motioned toward a clear plastic sleeve pulled from one of the side pockets. Inside was the notebook we'd found. The paper had swollen and warped, but a few words were still legible black ink against gray blur. One line stood out under the lamp: "Lost the trail. Fog's thick. Heading downhill." Under it, just 3 more words: "Love you, Mom." I didn't realize until later that I'd been holding my breath. The message was simple, but it pulled the whole mountain back into that July day, the light fading fog closing in 2 kids trying to find their way home. Marcus was careful with his words. "The soil and pollen on the fabric aren't from the area where you found them," he said. "They came from higher up, about 4, maybe 5 miles northeast of the loop. That was a part of the park few people ever reach: broken ridges, narrow paths that crumble underfoot, and sudden drop-offs that can swallow a person without a sound." I called in a small team, and we set out the next morning carrying the coordinates Marcus had given me. The ridge was brutal, dense undergrowth, loose shale places, where even the best boots slide backward more than they climb forward. The wind up there never stops. It drags at your clothes and whispers things you don't want to hear. By late afternoon, one of the volunteers, a firefighter from Eatonville, spotted a glint in the dirt near a shallow cave. At first, it looked like trash, but when I brushed the soil away, I saw the shine of silver. It was a bracelet thin and bent from age. The engraving caught the light Mia and Lily forever. Their father had mentioned giving it to them on their 16th birthday. The cave wasn't deep, just a shallow pocket in the rock wall, but inside, the air felt heavier. A torn piece of fabric clung to the stone, faded to a dull purple. A broken camera lens lay half-buried near a small fire ring gone cold years ago. And in the dirt near the back wall, a single boot print larger than mine pressed into the ground, preserved by dryness and shadow. I measured it twice. No teenage girl could have made it. Someone else had been here. Back at the command trailer, I entered everything into the log. It's strange how mechanical the process feels when you're writing down things you can't quite believe. I told Marcus what we'd found, and he asked for the bracelet and the fabric sample. "We'll need to confirm DNA," he said. His tone was calm, but I could hear the edge of urgency underneath. We both knew this wasn't going to end as just another lost hiker case. The following week, lab results came back confirming what we already feared: the fabric and bracelet matched the twins. But there was more. The bootprint soil carried traces of the same pollen found on the packs, meaning whoever left that print had been to both locations. That connected 2 points across 5 miles of some of the roughest terrain on Rainier. The implication was simple and sickening. Those packs hadn't been dropped where they were found. Someone had moved them. I pulled old reports from 2018, every citation, every name of anyone known to wander off established routes during that time. One file caught my eye: a man named Jared Voss. Minor poaching charges, nothing that ever stuck, but his patrol record showed a pattern operating in the same restricted zones near that ridge. I remembered him vaguely: a wiry man with bad eyes and a way of looking at you without blinking. The last entry in his file said he'd left the area later that same year. We reopened the case formally. Media found out within days. Reporters called it a break, but I didn't feel any of that excitement people expect when there's progress. What I felt was a familiar heaviness. I'd seen too many parents mistake new evidence for hope. Sarah Carter called that night after seeing the news. "Does this mean they were alive for a while?" she asked. I wanted to tell her yes, but I couldn't. I said only that we were following every lead. Her breath caught on the other end of the line, a small sound that said more than words ever could. 2 weeks later, Marcus's team pulled another fragment of truth from that ridge. A knife had been found near a creek, rusted handle wrapped in blue tape. When Marcus called to tell me, he said, "That's the same tape pattern Voss used on his traps." I remember it. He'd worked one of the earlier poaching cases. I drove back up with a search team, and this time we found more. Near a clearing above the creek sat the remnants of a camp charred logs, a half-buried tarp, the skeleton of a fire pit. Among the debris, a scrap of fabric matching the twins' clothing. The storm had tried to erase it, but it hadn't finished the job. As night fell, I saw headlights approaching through the trees. Sarah had driven up unannounced. I met her at the perimeter tape and explained that it was still an active site. She nodded but didn't move, clutching her daughter's old journal to her chest. "You'll tell me the truth when you know it," she said softly. I promised I would. Over the next few days, every piece of evidence pointed toward one conclusion: Voss had crossed paths with the girls. Whether it began as an accident or something darker, we couldn't yet say. The larger boot print, the relocated gear, the knife, it all drew the same line back to him. The state issued a warrant and detectives began tracking his last known address. It led to a rented cabin in Idaho, long abandoned floors, scarred with the same kind of soil we'd found in the cave. I went with the team to check it. The cabin stood half hidden behind a row of overgrown firs, the porch sagging under its own weight. Inside smelled of mildew and old smoke. There were traps hanging from the wall, a cot pushed into a corner, and on the table a small notebook, its pages curling. Most of it was lists, dates, weather notes, sketches of the mountain terrain. But near the back, written in the same jagged hand, were numbers, coordinates. The dates matched late July 2018 days after the girls vanished. At the bottom of one page, a sentence: "They saw me." That night, sitting in the motel parking lot with the rain starting again, I thought about that line. It explained everything and nothing. Maybe they'd walked into a clearing at the wrong time, seen something they weren't supposed to. A poacher guarding illegal traps won't risk being reported. Fear makes people do terrible things, and on a mountain, nobody hears the first mistake. We kept pushing, searching every point those coordinates marked. The terrain got worse the deeper we went, ravines filled with downed trees, sharp ledges hidden under moss, the kind of places daylight barely touches. On the third day of that search, just before sunset, one of the deputies called out from the creek bed. I climbed down to find him holding a small Polaroid, edges stiff with age. The photo showed two girls sitting against a rock wall, their hands bound with rope. The timestamp read July 17, 2018, 2 days after they disappeared. The image shook something in me I didn't know I still had the capacity to feel. I'd been on this mountain long enough to understand the language of accidents, slips, falls, weather, but this was different. This was human cruelty, deliberate and intimate. I bagged the photo myself and sealed it before handing it off to evidence control. None of us spoke much on the drive back down. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the rain ticking against the windows. Back at the station, I called Sarah again. I told her we'd found a photograph, but couldn't share details until the lab confirmed authenticity. She didn't cry. She just said, "So they were alive," as if repeating it might make time reverse. I didn't correct her. Some truths arrived too hard to bear all at once. When I finally got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that cave, the fire ring, the boots by the tree. 5 years of silence had ended, not with answers, but with more questions, each one heavier than the last. Somewhere out there, a man who'd vanished from our records had kept his own. We were tracing his footprints now, but the trail was old, and the mountain was good at hiding what it didn't want found. Before turning in, I stepped outside onto the porch. The rain had stopped and the night air smelled clean again, almost kind. I looked up toward the direction of the ridge, black against the sky, and thought about how long a secret can live in a place that doesn't need to explain itself. Somewhere up there, the truth was waiting, buried under years of dust and pine needles. And I knew even then we were only beginning to uncover what that mountain had been keeping. The Polaroid changed everything. That little square of faded color became the center of our world. I kept it sealed inside an evidence sleeve, but even through the plastic, the image felt alive. 2 girls against a rock wall, rope around their wrists, eyes wide with fear but somehow still clear, as if they believed someone might come. I've handled plenty of evidence over the years, bloody tools, wallets, notes, but I'd never felt a photograph look back at me before. The timestamp read July 17, 2018, 2 days after they vanished. That meant they'd survived at least that long. It also meant someone else had been with them. Within 48 hours, the case expanded beyond the park. State police joined, and the FBI offered their resources. My role shifted to field coordination, retracing the route between that cave and the coordinates found in Voss's notebook. His entries marked several camps, small clearings, old fire rings, water sources, each one, now potential ground for evidence. We split into teams moving ridge by ridge. It was rough country, steep inclines, thick alder, and miles of fallen timber that turned every 100 yards into a climb. The wind never stopped. It carried that sharp mineral smell of stone that's been wet too long. On the 5th day of the search, a volunteer called out near a stream bend where the soil had slumped after a rain. I climbed down and saw the tip of a knife handle poking through the mud, wrapped in a strip of blue tape. The sight of it hit me like déjà vu. Voss had used that same pattern on his traps. The handle was almost rotted through, but the tape's color was still visible, like a signature that refused to fade. We flagged the area, photographed it, and sent it off to the lab. That night, sitting by the command tent, I listened to the radio chatter, taper off, until only static filled the air. The mountain was black beyond the light poles. I remember staring into that dark and feeling the weight of 5 silent years pressing back. We were closer than ever, but every discovery felt like a slow unpeeling of grief rather than relief. Sarah came by quietly around 10, wrapped in her husband's old parka. She didn't ask about the Polaroid. She didn't need to. She just stood beside me, watching the fog slide across the valley. "If they were together, that's all I can stand to think about," she whispered. I told her they had each other, that much we knew. She nodded once, tears catching the light, and walked back toward her car. The next morning brought the results from Tacoma. The knife bore the same pollen and soil mix as the Ridge Cave and the packs by the cedar. That tied everything together in one grim map, 3 sites, same signature. Voss's DNA was on the handle, mixed faintly with the twins. I drove the report straight to the district office. There's a kind of silence in a room when proof replaces speculation. Nobody spoke for a full minute after I laid the folder on the table. Finally, the detective from Pierce County leaned back and said, "We find him. We finish it." We turned to his Idaho cabin again, combing through every scrap. Beneath a loose board under the cot, we found a weathered notebook sealed in a plastic pouch. Most of it was what you'd expect: trap counts, meat weights, but near the end, coordinates matched the same region where we'd found the knife. A few lines stood out. July 19th, storm came early. Hideout flooded. Move East Ridge. That was 4 days after the Polaroid timestamp. In the corner of the page, written smaller, "They got loose." The letters dug deep into the paper like he'd pressed harder with each stroke. We hiked the East Ridge the next day, following the new coordinates. By noon, clouds rolled in heavy, the kind that make the sky feel close to the ground. The air smelled like thunder. We found a narrow crevice hidden behind ferns, half cave, half crawl space. Inside, the floor was littered with old canvas, a cracked canteen, and a sleeping bag that had turned stiff with dirt. When we lifted it, a small notebook slid out. The handwriting was the same jagged scrawl as the one in Idaho, but this one wasn't a journal. It was more like a log of his movements, dates, elevations, cryptic notes, like "quiet tonight" and "too thin to climb." One entry stopped us cold. July 23rd. One gone. The other crying. There was no name, but we didn't need one. Under that notebook, tucked between layers of cloth, was another Polaroid. It showed the same cave, same wall, but this time only one girl was visible, staring toward the camera. The other side of the frame was empty. We bagged it, labeled it, and left the cave in silence. The rain started as we hiked down, hard, steady, punishing. By the time we reached the trucks, everyone was soaked and quiet, each of us trying not to picture what that second photo implied. Back at the office, Marcus called to tell me they'd found traces of human blood inside the sleeping bag. The DNA matched both sisters. It confirmed what our gut already knew: they hadn't died quickly. They'd fought, survived, maybe even escaped for a time before the mountains swallowed them again. The realization settled like a stone in my chest. I'd spent decades telling families the same line: "We'll bring them home," but this was the first time I truly understood what it costs to mean it. The next phase became a manhunt. Detectives tracked financial records, phone traces, every rumor of a drifter matching Voss's description. He was known for disappearing into forests, living off traps and trade. That kind of man doesn't leave a digital trail. But one lead stuck a purchase at a gas station near Boise cash payment camera footage showing a tall man with a scar along his cheek loading supplies into an old truck. The date less than a month before, we found the packs. It wasn't proof, but it was close enough to stir every sleeping nerve in law enforcement. Meanwhile, we had to go back to the mountain, back to where the girl's story ended. A second search along the ridge led us to a narrow overhang above a valley. The soil there looked disturbed darker and looser than the rest. The forensic team moved in carefully, working under portable floodlights as the sun fell. It didn't take long before one of them called my name. I walked over Hart already knowing. Two small frames lay side by side beneath the surface, bones pale and fragile against the dark earth. One still wore a fragment of purple cloth. Between them, half buried, was a rusted shackle with a snapped chain. The metal was brittle, but the break was clean, deliberate, a sign of struggle. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The floodlights hummed. Rain hissed on the tarps we'd stretched overhead. I stood there staring at what 5 years of searching had led to and felt an ache settle in my bones that no kind of justice could erase. We worked through the night, cataloging every inch of the site. When the remains were finally lifted, I stayed behind while the others packed up. The air was cold, the kind that crawls into your lungs and stays there. I looked out over the valley, half expecting the mountain to close itself again, to hide what we'd just uncovered. But it didn't. It just stood silent, massive, unblinking. Back at base, Marcus confirmed the identities through dental records. The news reached Sarah by dawn. She arrived at the ranger station hours later, eyes red but dry. I met her outside under a sky still streaked with the remnants of last night's storm. When I told her, she didn't cry right away. She just let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a prayer, then said, "At least they're not alone." I didn't know what to say, so I just stood with her until the silence felt less cruel. The investigation pressed forward, gathering momentum from grief. The evidence from the grave tied back to Voss, the same pollen, same soil, same rope fibers as those in the cave. We had enough for an arrest warrant. Detectives tracked him to a rundown trailer park outside Boise. I went along not because it was required, but because after 5 years of walking that mountain, I needed to see the man who'd turned it into a tomb. When we moved in, it was just before dusk. The light was thin, the air heavy with the smell of dust and fuel. His truck sat out front loaded with gear. As we approached, the door flew open. Voss stepped out, scar shining pale under his stubble. He didn't run. He just looked at us like a man caught between fight and surrender. The officers surrounded him, weapons drawn but voices steady. I stood a few feet back watching as they cuffed him. He didn't speak until they read him his rights. Then he said quiet but clear, "They saw me poaching. Couldn't let it go." He lifted his head and looked straight at me. "They ran. I buried them when they stopped moving." It wasn't the screams some victims' families dream about, hearing the dramatic confession that brings closure. It was plain, stripped of emotion, as if he were reciting a list. And somehow, that made it worse. The truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits there unshakable. Back in Washington, the official announcement broke the next morning. Reporters called it an ending, but I knew better. The mountain doesn't hand out endings, it offers reminders. The evidence would go to trial. The man would face judgment. But the silence he left behind, the fog, the footprints, the quiet spaces between those two backpacks, those belonged to the mountain now. That night I couldn't sleep. I went outside and looked toward the ridgeline. The stars were clear, the air colder than it had been in weeks. Somewhere out there the cedar still stood, with its roots tangled in old earth, the place where this had all begun again. I thought about the girls, about Sarah sitting somewhere in her house, holding that last journal entry. Lost the trail. Fog's thick, heading downhill. Love you, Mom. And I wondered if maybe in their final moments they found a piece of peace the mountain had never given anyone else, the kind that comes when you know the fight is over and someone will finally listen. I stayed out there until the horizon turned gray. Tomorrow I knew the lab reports would bring one more twist, one more unanswered question to chase. But for that hour, under the slow breath of the pines, I let the silence stand. It was heavy, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, the mountain didn't feel like it was keeping a secret. It felt like it was grieving with us. The morning after the arrest, the mountain was wrapped in cloud again. You couldn't see 10 feet past the tree line. It felt almost deliberate, as if the place wanted to cover itself to reclaim its silence now that the noise of men had finally passed through. I stood near the cedar where the backpacks had rested months before the ground soft from rain, and for the first time since the beginning there were no reporters, no search teams, no yellow tape. Just the sound of water dripping from the branches and the smell of pine mixing with wet soil. The mountain was whole again, though none of us were. When Voss was extradited back to Washington, he didn't fight it. During questioning, he gave short, flat answers. Yes, no, maybe, until the evidence closed in around him. The Polaroids, the notebooks, the blood, the rope fibers, all of it left no room for the lies he'd rehearsed. The confession came out quiet and low, almost as if he were describing the weather. He said the twins had stumbled into one of his illegal camps. They'd seen traps, maybe caught his face on their camera, and he panicked. What started as fear became control, and what followed was cruelty. There was no excuse, only the kind of reasoning that makes a person less than human. The trial began that fall. Sarah attended every hearing. She sat in the same spot, third row from the front, hands clasped together on her lap. I don't think she blinked through most of it. When the prosecution read from the journal, Mia's handwriting trembling across the final page, half the courtroom went still. I'd heard those words before, but hearing them aloud in her voice, even read by someone else, broke something open in me I didn't know was still unhealed. Voss didn't look up once. His lawyer said he was cooperating. I don't think that word belongs anywhere near what he'd done. The verdict came fast. Guilty on all counts, 2 murders, kidnapping, unlawful confinement, poaching. He was sentenced to life without parole. No applause, no outbursts, just an exhale from everyone in the room, like a door had finally closed on something that had been open too long. Sarah leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and whispered, "They can rest now." I'd heard that line in movies and reports over the years, but when she said it, it didn't sound like a cliché. It sounded like faith rebuilt from splinters. After the sentencing, I walked out alone. The courthouse steps were slick from an early rain, the kind that turns the air metallic. A small group of volunteers from the search teams stood off to one side, hugging quietly faces I hadn't seen since the early days. Some of them still wore the same jackets from 2018, faded and frayed patches barely holding. One of them nodded to me, and I nodded back. Nothing needed to be said. We'd all carried our part of that weight, and it would never fully leave us. Life has a way of moving forward, even when you're still looking backward. By spring, the park had returned to its rhythm. Families at the visitor center, couples taking selfies against the snowfields, laughter echoing through the valleys. But for those of us who'd lived the search, the mountain never looked the same. Every shadowed ridge, every fold of fog carried memory. I kept walking those trails out of habit, but there were moments I'd stop mid-step, half expecting to hear a distant call that would never come. Sarah kept in touch. Some days, it was a short message. A photo of the memorial bench installed near the Paradise Trailhead. The inscription simple and clean, for Mia and Lily, who loved the climb. Other days she called just to ask how the mountain looked, as if knowing the weather there could tell her something about her daughters. She'd ask if the wildflowers were blooming yet, or if the marmots were out near the rocks. I'd answer as best I could, but I knew what she really wanted to hear, that somewhere in that vast, unkind wilderness, her girls had found peace. The Park Service commissioned a small safety program in their honor, funded partly by donations from the Carter family and partly by volunteers who'd helped in the search. We called it the Carter Initiative. It focused on training young hikers in navigation, weather preparedness, and backcountry ethics. Every year since I've spoken at the orientation, reading Mia's last journal entry aloud. The kids listen quietly, most of them too young to remember the case. When I tell them that the line, "Love you, Mom," was written with frozen hands in fading light, it's not to frighten them. It's to remind them that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the act of leaving a message behind. Dr. Hale moved on to another division, but before he left, he gave me a photograph from the first day we reopened the case. It showed the 2 backpacks under that cedar, the colors almost gone sunlight filtering through the branches. He said he thought I should have it as proof that persistence still mattered. I keep it in a frame on my desk. Visitors sometimes mistake it for an ordinary hiking scene. I let them. Not every story needs to announce itself. As for me, I stayed in service another year before retiring. The park has younger eyes now, stronger knees, and fresh optimism. That's the way it should be. But even after I turned in my badge, I couldn't quite leave. I still live a few miles from the southern boundary. When the fog drifts low enough, it curls over my porch like it's checking to see if I remember its voice. And I do. I always will. Sometimes when hikers stop by my gate to ask about routes or weather, I catch a flash of youth in their faces, bright eyes, sturdy boots, the same mix of nerves and excitement I saw in those girls the morning they set out. I always remind them to check their maps twice, to tell someone where they're going to respect the mountain. Most just smile and say they will. And when they drive off, I stand there a while listening to the sound of tires fading up the road until I can't tell if the ringing in my ears is the wind or memory. The Carters still visit once a year. They come quietly, usually early in the morning before tourists fill the lot. They bring wildflowers from their garden lilies for lily pink phlox for Mia and lay them at the bench. I walk with them sometimes, and we sit for a while in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Sarah talks about her daughters as if they're still out there somewhere, and maybe in some way they are. Nature has a strange way of holding on to those who loved it most. The wind carries voices if you listen long enough. Justice gives you paperwork trials and headlines. But closure, if it exists at all, comes later in quieter forms. For Sarah, it came in the knowledge that her daughters were found together. For me, it came in learning that sometimes doing your job isn't about saving lives, it's about giving truth a place to rest. The mountain never apologized, and I never asked it to. It simply reminded us what it always had, that beauty and danger share the same ground, and sometimes you only see one because of the other. I think about the twins often, not as victims, but as girls who loved the wild so much they wanted to see its edges. They prepared, they planned, they believed they'd be back by sunset. I imagine them laughing near the waterfall in that final photo, the sound of rushing water drowning out the rest of the world. It's a better image to hold than what came after. 5 years is a long time to chase an echo. But when we finally caught it, when the truth came out of the dark, it didn't roar, it whispered. It said, "We were here." And that's enough. Now when I hike the ridge in early morning light, I leave 2 small stones on the trail where the fog thins. It's not ritual, just acknowledgement, a way of saying I haven't forgotten. And when the wind moves through the trees, it sometimes sounds like laughter, far off in the distance, the kind that fades slowly but never really ends. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering in the end is the only kind of rescue we have left.